This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We start with K-State Weed Science Specialist Sarah Lancaster and Southeastern Area Agronomist Bruno Pedreira. They both address practices for controlling weeds in pastures this time of year after receiving multiple calls regarding Hemp Dogbane. Also ahead, Chief Farm Program Specialist with the Kansas Farm Service Agency, Todd Barrows, reminds producers to update their farm operation plans as needed and provides an update on current drought assistance programs available for livestock producers. On this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, K-State College of Veterinary Medicine experts Brad White, Bob Larson, and Brian Lubbers answer a listener's question on how to diagnose and prevent acute interstitial pneumonia in feedlots. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back with two specialists out of K-State. We have with us Bruno Pedreira. He is a southeastern area agronomist, and Sarah Lancaster. She is a weed science specialist. And today I have both of you here joining this conversation to cover best management practices for weed control in pastures, which you've both been getting lots of calls about from what I understand.
Yes, Samantha. Thanks for having us today. I think that's important to mention. We're coming from a bad last year. We got a lot of problems in the last fall with armyworms, and we still are in a very dry summer. So the drought stress we have at this point over our plants are kind of creating this room for weeds, and the weed management practice needs to be one kind of thing we need to pay attention at this time of the year.
Absolutely. Two key things you mentioned there, not only the drought stress that we're currently experiencing, but also just recovery from the damage from fall armyworms last year. And that's really left our pastures, like you said, very susceptible to these weeds that are just taking over in areas. So Sarah, tell us a little bit about some of the planning that needs to be done. This isn't a short-term fix that can be done overnight. It's long-term, right?
Yeah, you're right, Samantha. Pasture weed management is an interesting thing because ideally we have a really dense stand of forage that is going to be very competitive and in most cases outcompete weeds for the resources the weeds need to grow. And so, really when we think about long-term weed management in pastures, we're thinking about things like managing your grazing well. A lot of times the places we'll see weeds first are in areas that have been overgrazed. The other thing to pay attention to is soil fertility. A lot of times when we're in situations where, for example, we're doing a lot of hay removal or something, we think about maybe replacing that nitrogen, but also paying attention to phosphorus and potassium and also soil pH is really important for making sure that we have that good, dense stand of forage that we need to outcompete at least most of the annual species that we're going to see coming through in our pastures.
Absolutely. Bruno, I know overgrazing is really easy to do in the conditions we're currently experiencing. So when it comes to trying to mitigate that issue, what are some best practices for producers to put in place now?
I think the first thing we need to have in mind is we need to have a plan for the pasture. How that pasture fits in your whole system, okay? We need to think in the long-term goal, how that pasture fits on it. What I'm expecting out of it in terms of forage accumulation. How many animals I'm going to have there, stocking rates. And I need to plan it in order to give the plants the chance to regrowth. So one of the best things we could do for our pastures is to try to think about rotational grazing. Every time we are talking about continuous grazing, the continuous means that animals will be in that pasture continuously. It means that the plants, sometimes they do not have the time they need to regrowth. The animals are there removing leaves, and the forage plants are using the reserves they have, most on the roots, to try to put a new leaf out. And the animals are removing that. So we kind of end up with a negative balance for that plant. And if we do it for a long term, those plants that should be perennial, they start to failing at some point and making room for weeds, as Sarah already mentioned. So grazing management, it needs to be kind of things that comes first when we are talking about the long-term pasture. And I like to highlight, Samantha, that when we plant a pasture, we do not plant it for use for 2 years, 3 years. We always have in mind that it should be there for 15, 20. So Sarah already mentioned soil fertility. Why we don't take more soil samples out of it? If we are talking about hay field, you can have like 40 units of potash or 12 units of phosphorus in a brown field or in a pasture field being removed in every ton of hay that we send out. So if we do not replenish it, if we do not, thinking about, for example, stubble heights in our hay fields. Sometimes I like to ask our farmers, how do you set the mower? And sometimes I don't get the answer. That's one of the trials we have right now in parcels. Try to harvest them with 1, 3, 5, and 7-inch stalk. Does it change? Yes, for sure. The canopy will be different after a 1-inch harvest, and it makes much more room. So most of our plants, we are talking about, molding from 3 to 4 inches at least. Leave some leaves behind. So we need the solar panel that will make new photosynthesis, replenish the roots reserves, and the plants will be there for us forever, hopefully.
Establishing that canopy is really the important message here, I guess, that we're trying to get across for producers that are tuning in. But if producers are they're being honest with themselves and they're like, I've lagged in this area and now I have some major weed issues, what should their first step be in combating that?
So as we think about weed management plans in general, Samantha, step number 1 is proper identification of the weeds. I think a lot of times we kind of skip over that basic thing, but I think that's super critical. Most people can tell, okay, I've got a grass or I've got a certain type of broadleaf weed, but making sure we know if that weed is an annual weed or if that weed is a perennial weed. In any environment, the most troublesome weeds are going to be the perennials, especially in a perennial cropping system. We're more apt to see those perennial weeds start to creep in and take over. And then the second thing, I think, is to figure out, okay, what's a short-term fix? Do we have herbicide options for this weed? What are the most effective herbicide options that are going to give us a level of crop safety that we're comfortable with? A lot of our pastures in eastern Kansas are smooth brome grass. And smooth brome is pretty sensitive to some of the herbicides that we can use for selective weed control in their pastures. So making sure we're going to use the right application parameters. So thinking about spray volume, spray nozzle selection. Are we going to broadcast spray or spot spray or maybe a weed wiper? So thinking about the application method is important. And then after you get that short-term fix figured out with your herbicides, then going into a long-term kind of maintenance plan. So, one of the weeds that we struggle with in a lot of our pastures just on a regular basis is Serratia lespedeza, right? It's a noxious weed in the state of Kansas. There are programs that we can take advantage of as landowners to help get the herbicides we need to control that weed. But the thing to remember is that it's a long-term plan. We might knock the weeds back that are here today, but those weeds may regrow, and we also have to manage that weed seed bank.
So patience is really key here, I guess, is one of the things we're trying to communicate. Everybody wants a quick fix, but some of these issues just can't be resolved. It needs to be, a 5 to 10 year plan for some of these pastures. Bruno, some of that includes considering what you're planting. Is that correct?
Yes, we can think about what we are going to have in that area if we are changing pastures or if we already have a established pasture, what we expecting out of it. And in most of the times, we don't have selected herbicides. So we need to come up with a plan. I think that's the main goal in our conversation today. As Sarah mentioned, identify the weeds. Identify how we are going to work on it. I think most of the farmers, they just think about spray. And she mentioned that's very important. If you can wipe it or if you can spot why I'm going to spray the whole area. Sometimes we have really good broadleafs that we want to have in our pasture, especially if we're talking about the native plants. So put all of those things together and ask yourself, what is the long-term goal? And if I want to move forward, I need to identify why the weeds are there. I think that will be the main question. And it will help you to define the next crop. And sometimes we need to crop for 1 year or two if the situation is too bad. Instead of trying to put a new brome field over an old brome field, taken over by weeds, I may be cropping it for a year or so and come back with the new brome field. And then I will have more options in terms of herbicides to kill them while I have wheat there or corn or beans or whatever. And then we establish the new pastures.
I know you guys have been getting a lot of calls about some specific weeds here lately, and 2 of those being broom sedge and then hemp dogbane, I believe. So tell us a little bit about those specifically.
Let's start with actually the easier one first, Samantha. Let's talk hemp dogbane. Hemp dogbane is a broadleaf weed species. It sometimes gets confused with milkweeds. Branches a little more than milkweeds, but it has that same milky sap, so it's real hard to distinguish. But hemp dogbane is a perennial weed. It's native to Kansas, so it's not terribly hard to find, but it is becoming more problematic, probably because we've just got more opportunities right now for that weed to flourish. There are some herbicide options for hemp dogbane, though. Some of the more effective options are going to be products that contain the active ingredient fluroxapyr. In pastures, it's a component of pasture guard. And so pasture guard is a good product to think about if you want to try to control hemp dogbane. 2,4-D does have some efficacy. Dicamba does have some efficacy on hemp dogbane as well. It will probably be less than products that contain fluroxapyr, but you hit the nail on the head, Samantha. You said earlier that these problems are going to take a while to fix, right? They probably didn't develop overnight, and so they're not going to be fixed overnight. So as a perennial weed, hemp dogbane is probably going to take multiple years of herbicide applications to really get that under control.
And then as far as broom sedge goes, I think we're going to include this in a whole other discussion. But if we want to preview a little some of the important points there with that weed group, let's hit on that a little bit, Bruno.
I'll tell you, management, soil fertility, and we may be able to wipe it at some point of the year. Most of these fields have been taking soil samples out of them, and they are very short in potash and phosphorus and pH. So why we have a warm season perennial grass taking over our hay fields, for example, that they are not competitive, they are not aggressive as fescue or brown. Some of the trials that we are taking over here, when we allow the fescue to grow and we fertilize the fescue, they were able to grow enough that there was no room for broom sedge here. It means that we are killing the broom sedge? No. It means that we are giving the fescue the opportunity to grow and to be even more competitive. And for that reason, by the end of the year, we have increased the yield of the fescue and we reduced the proportion of the broom sedge in the area. But as you mentioned, we need a few more minutes to discuss about broom sedge. That's a very nice topic and we have been working on it, and most of our farmers has been struggling with it right now.
Once again, that was Bruno Pedreira. He is the southeastern area agronomist here at K-State, and Sarah Lancaster, our weed science specialist. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We have with us Todd Barrows. He is a farm program chief with the Farm Service Agency here in Kansas. So, Todd, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. It's always great to be part of your program, Samantha, and we're happy to be here. As we're going through this summer and we're transitioning into fall, and with the high temperatures we've had and lack of rainfall over our state, I thought it would just be appropriate to come and sit down and visit a little bit with the producers and you all about updates that they need to be looking forward to with their farm programs and farm operations, and then also just make sure producers are aware of and continue to work towards submitting or filing their emergency recovery program applications, as well as just to fill them in on where we at as far as preparing for the 2021 program payment cycle coming up the 1st of October. And finally, we wanted to provide an update on drought assistance program for our livestock producers. We don't want to forget about our important livestock producers because they're truly suffering from the drought just as much as the crop producers.
Absolutely, yeah. Crunch time for everybody in terms of being pushed to the limits right now with the drought. But you mentioned payments coming up, so let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention it, and it's maybe not as big an issue this year as in normal years because of the higher prices received in the cash grain. But I did want to touch base. We are ending the 2021 marketing year, and while we're not anticipating a lot of payments, it's just important that we cover our bases on there and let producers kind of know what we're seeing and what they can expect. And as I mentioned, because of the higher than normal average cash market prices that they received in the cash grain market over the past marketing year, the average market prices, especially for wheat, barley, and oats, which has already been announced on July 18th, we know that that market year average price was higher than the projected price or the national loan rate, so there will be no PLC payments for those commodities. Now, that only takes part of half the producers, but the other half of the producers that are enrolled in the 2021 Ark County Revenue Program, we suspect that there probably will not be much of a payment, if any, because of those higher cash prices as well. But I also wanted to cover with them as far as payments and how that's calculated, just so, again, refamiliarize the producers with that process. So we take the county average yield for that covered commodity times the higher of the market year average price, or the national loan rate to come up with the applicable commodity price. But as I stated, for wheat, the market year average price was $7.63 a bushel, barley was $5.31 a bushel, and oats was $4.55 a bushel. So in all three cases, we know that that's higher than the national loan rate. So to recap, if you take the market year average cash value times the county average yield to compute the actual revenue, and then payments are earned when the actual revenue is less than the guarantee, which that guarantee is computed by using the crop insurance projected price. And, of course, our average yearly market price by far exceeded that projection price. As far as feed grain values, corn, grain, sorghum, soybeans, again, we won't know those until the market year comes to close on September 30th, and then those prices will be announced shortly after. But, again, we're just not anticipating any payments under the PLC program, and little, if any, will generate under the Ark County revenue.
Before, you also mentioned updating farm operating plans. So for producers tuning in, what does that really look like?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring this up. I like to do it every fall. We ask producers that regardless of how they're conducting their farm business, if they are seeking benefits, then we must have a current or accurate farm operating plan on file and of how they are conducting their farm operating business. So we encourage producers, as they have time, maybe between planting and harvest or after harvest this fall, to look at their past farm operating plan for 2022 and see if there's any changes that need to be made and updated for the 2023 crop year. Some of those changes to think about would be like have member change in your entity structure. Or the other thing is, have you changed your land, and do we need to add land? Have you purchased new land? Or have you changed your leasing agreement with your owner from either cash lease to share rent? Those are things to be thinking about as we transition, and you need to update in your farm records.
Let's move on. There's been a little discussion around the Emergency Relief Program, or ERP. How is that progressing currently in Kansas?
Yeah, just to bring you all up to date, we are currently, they're calling in Phase 1B of that ERP program, or Emergency Relief Program. And 1B includes the initial data pull of all producers with federal crop insurance claims or indemnities and NAP coverage producers that suffered a production loss due to a qualifying disaster event and received an indemnity payment. And again, this would be for 2020 or 2021 crop year. Now, with that being said, we are looking to move into Phase 1C by the end of August. And 1C will include a second data pull for federal crop insurance claims, and that would capture producers that may not have had their federal crop insurance claim finalized prior to the initial data pull. And then also it's going to capture those producers that have supplemental coverage options such as SCO or STACS, which is stacked income protection for your cotton producers, and then also your MP or margin protection plans. So that is all supposed to be rolling out here in Phase 1C by the end of August. So we'll keep our fingers crossed and hope that shows up. And then the last piece of the pie as far as ERP is what they're calling Phase 2. And we think that will roll out sometime later this fall, early winter, which will include your crops not covered by crop insurance or not covered by insurance that suffered a production loss due to a qualifying disaster event. And again, that's in calendar year 2020 and or 2021. And these would be insured crops that suffered a shallow loss, meaning that the crop was insured. However, the yield loss or production loss was not great enough to trigger an indemnity payment.
Are there any other updates on programs targeted for livestock producers specifically?
Yeah, I don't want to forget about our important livestock producers out there. So just want to give you a quick rundown because the drought just continues to creep on. And since we are in the normal grazing season for our livestock native grass forages, the livestock forage program has been enacted. It's triggered off of the U.S. Drought Monitor, and that covers 2/3 to 3/4 of our state right now. And the point that I wanted to bring up, as the drought continues, producers are qualifying for extra months of payment due to that grazing loss. Remember, this is all based on the U.S. Drought Monitor, and 5 months is a maximum loss a producer can receive. However, if a producer has made an initial application during the 2022 grazing season and the drought intensifies in their area, no additional action is required on their part. FSA will just process that additional payment and kick it out based upon the drought monitor and that drought intensity. And then the next program that I wanted to talk about is the livestock feed transportation, and that might not be quite as well known as LFP, but it is also triggered off of the U.S. Drought Monitor. So essentially, if you are in a county that is eligible for the livestock forage program, you could also qualify for the livestock feed transportation program. And this program is to help defer or help cover the transportation costs purchase feedstuffs outside of your normal trade area that you are having to purchase to keep your cow herd going or your grazing livestock going above your normal yearly purchases. Again, this is only for purchase feedstuffs, and it helps pay for that transportation cost that is greater than 25 miles, not to exceed 1,000 miles. And we pay assistance on loaded miles only at $6.44 a mile. And then the last program I wanted to mention is the livestock transportation. But in this case, instead of bringing the forage stuff to the livestock, this is moving the livestock to the available grazed forage stuff. So again, if your livestock operation is in an LFP eligible county, we will help with the cost of transporting that livestock to available grazing forage in a non-drought impacted county through the livestock transportation program. This program is to help the transportation costs to move that eligible livestock to a non-impacted drought county where forage resources are available for grazing. Again, it must be more than 25 miles, not to exceed 1,000 miles. Again, we will pay on only the loaded miles at $6.44 a mile. And we only pay for moving the livestock to the grazed forage availability. We do not pay to move the livestock back home at the end of the grazing season.
Absolutely. Some important programs for sure.
One last thing as we wrap up today, I do want to point out one last reminder. September 1st is quickly approaching, and that is the application closing date under our NAP program for our non-insured assistance program. And this is where producers can apply for insurance coverage on perennial and fall planted or small grain grazing and hay forage crops for their livestock producers. With that thought, producers who are historically underserved, such as socially disadvantaged, beginning farmer, veteran farmer, or limited resource producer, as a reminder, FSA waives the service fee for these producers. And then, as always, for more details on the information we talked about today or any other programs that we administer, please, producers, do not hesitate to reach out to your local USDA service centers and get your questions answered. We're there to help as best we can, or you can go online at usda.gov and pull up the normal fact sheets for these programs and all other programs that we administer.
Once again, that was Todd Barrows. He is a farm program chief with Farm Service Agency here in Kansas. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're ending our Wednesday programming as we always do with our team of experts from K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine with the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts segment. This week, our experts are Brad White, Bob Larson, and Brian Lubbers.
Hi, welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where our experts answer your questions. I'm Brad White, and with me today is Dr. Brian Lubbers, who does food animal therapeutics here at Kansas State.
Hi, Brad.
And Dr. Bob Larson, also a veterinarian with Kansas State.
Hey, guys.
On BCI Ask the Experts, we find the right experts to answer your beef production questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can send us an email at bci@ksu.edu with BCI Ask the Experts in the subject line. Our format is I'll ask each expert the same listener question, and they will have a chance to provide input, then respond to each other's comments. Each response will receive points with a maximum of 10 points available. And today's question comes to us from a listener that asks, how should we diagnose and prevent acute interstitial pneumonia in feedlots? Brian, you're up first.
I think maybe better start with what is AIP. So acute interstitial pneumonia, or AIP, it's a respiratory disease in cattle. And I think we all agree on that. And then after that, what we know or don't know gets pretty sketchy. But if we think about traditional bacterial respiratory disease, that occurs inside the alveoli. And the alveoli are small sacs within the lung that communicate with the external environment through the respiratory passages. AIP is a respiratory disease that occurs between the sacs of that lung tissue. So it's not directly communicating with the outside air. And typically we think of it as trapped air, or like if you think of emphysema or like a smoker's lung.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, so it is a respiratory disease, so you're going to see some difficulty breathing and those same types of problems. But like Brian said, it's a little bit different causes. A lot of times it can be quite serious in that maybe I don't know as much as I should, but I think cattle with AIP are more likely to die than cattle with more typical pneumonia. It's not as common, and there will be some similarities, but it is a little bit different type of a disease. And as a producer, I may not notice that much of a difference. It just looks like cattle having difficulty breathing. But as a veterinarian, when you think about, well, it's a slightly different diagnosis and maybe some different interventions.
Absolutely. And Brian, 7 points for your answer. And Bob, you got 6 points for that. Now, I'd like to ask you guys, we talked a little bit about what does it look like diagnostically. How do we manage those cases, or what type of cattle? Bob, you mentioned it has a different appearance than typical BRD. Maybe delve into that, and I'll go to you first.
Well, I'm going to go back to kind of the diagnosis. As a veterinarian, I think that sometimes I can just tell the difference in the way the cattle are breathing, that this one's the typical pneumonia and this one's AIP. When I followed that up with necropsies where we open up a dead animal, I'm wrong more often than I would like to be. And so a lot of times it's hard to tell in a live animal. So that's why it's really helpful to go ahead and do a necropsy on dead animals to really differentiate, is this a pneumonia or is this an AIP? And then even in those situations, sometimes it helps to send some of those tissues into the lab and really look at the tissue under the microscope to be certain about kind of what's going on there. So I can't always tell by just looking at the cattle. Sometimes I think I can, but I really need to do some necropsies and look at those.
Okay, can't tell by looking at the cattle. Brian, what would you recommend?
I actually agree with Bob. You can't separate normal bacterial pneumonia from AIP just clinically, although how we do it traditionally is we typically think that AIP is a disease of later feeding stage cattle. Maybe heifers are a little more predisposed. And so we use that. If it's a heifer late in the feeding stages and it has respiratory disease, we probably are overdiagnosing AIP, although we're finding some data that says maybe that's not true. And if you want a gold standard, it's histopathology on the lungs.
Excellent. So I can only diagnose it there in the dead cattle. Quick question on, so you guys talked about not knowing the risk factors. Do we have any way of preventing AIP?
Not really at this stage. It's one of the more frustrating diseases.
There are some toxins that are associated with AIP-like diseases, and maybe we can prevent feeding those feeds, but kind of the normal AIP, we don't know what causes it, so we don't know how to prevent it.
Excellent. Well, Brian ended up with 9 points, but I had to take one away because he agreed with Bob, and so Bob ended up with 7. Still gave Brian a good score. Thanks for joining us for BCI Ask the Experts. If you'd like to hear more from BCI experts, join us on the weekly BCI Cattle Chat podcast. And remember, to get your question answered, send us an email at bci@ksu.edu with BCI Ask the Experts in the subject line.
Once again, that was BCI's Ask the Experts segment, covered this week by experts Brad White, Bob Larson, and Brian Lubbers. We'll be back with more tomorrow over the K-State Radio Network. This has been Agriculture Today.